Mr. Ross, you're ready to...
Yes, thank you.
Since we're all here, good morning and welcome. I declare open this morning's public hearing of the Joint Standing Committee on Trade and Investment Growth for the inquiry into the understanding and utilisation of benefits available under free trade agreements. In accordance with the committee's resolution of 7th of September 2022, this hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. I now welcome Mr. Tim Ross from the Grain Trade Australia. For the Hansard record, would you please just state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Yes, my full name is Timothy Mark Ross. I work for Grain Trade Australia as the Operations and Projects Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I'll now invite you to make a short opening statement of a few minutes, and then we'll proceed to a discussion and a bit of a Q&A and informal discussion. Over to you, Mr. Ross.
Thank you. Look, firstly, GTA welcomes the opportunity to present to the committee and to the inquiry into the understanding and utilisation of benefits under free trade agreements. Grain Trade Australia, it's a national association. We've got approximately 295 customers and associations as our members, and we consider GTA as a focal point for the commercial grain industry within Australia. So our role is to work to facilitate trade, supported by an industry-driven self-regulatory framework. And this framework includes the Australian Grain Industry Code of Practice, grain trading rules, grain contracts and grain trading standards. The grain industry produced 51 million tonnes in the 23-24 season and reported an industry value of $43.7 billion for 2023-24. So the industry certainly has a positive outlook at the moment and a positive trajectory. However, the trade of grain certainly faces global challenges, economic pressures, food security concerns within countries, geopolitical tensions and unpredictable climatic conditions complicate trade. These factors can lead to protectionism and trade barriers. Therefore, it is critical that markets are driven by the forces of supply and demand and not politically motivated distortions. Trade is certainly vital for the Australian grain industry and regional communities, with the Australian grain industry being highly export orientated. 65 to 75% of the annual grain production is exported. GTA strongly supports the establishment of free trade agreements as they present a unique opportunity to deepen and strengthen trade and economic ties with our trading partners in their countries. Increasing existing and opening new export market opportunities for Australian grain and reducing distortions in global markets are key priorities for the industry. GTA considers successful bilateral agreements can provide a significant increase in the export value to the Australian grain industry. To maximise these market opportunities, ongoing reform of both tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade is required. Non-tariff barriers remain an impediment to the international trade of grain, and any trade agreement must include a focus on the development and the implementation of a systemic approach to addressing these barriers. The economic and opportunity costs of these distortions are ultimately borne by producers and the consumers. GTA does acknowledge the achievements of governments in both regional and bilateral trade agreements. We believe it is important these trade agreements continue to remain in place to provide a framework for trade, improve market access and foster tariff reductions and the impact of non-tariff measures. GTA also believes that in addition to the bilateral approach, a multilateral approach to trade policy arrangements also serves an important role in efficient trade facilitation. International bodies such as the World Trade Organisation, the International Plant Protection Convention and regional bodies such as APEC and ASEAN serve important roles and functions to provide a rules-based global trade framework. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. free trade agreements present a unique opportunity to strengthen trade and economic ties with our trading partners, and GTA supports them as a strategy for both government and industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ross, and thank you for appearing before the committee today. With us, we have my colleagues who are here, Deputy Chair, Mr. Scott Bushholtz, and Senator Helen Polly, and we'll be joined shortly, I believe, maybe or maybe not, by Ms. Tanya Plebisek from Perth. Ms. Tanya Lawrence from Perth, who was on the committee as well. I might kick off with a few questions. First of all, just thank you for the incredible industry that the Grain Trade Association represents, one of our largest exporters, and one of the benefits to the economy, to our nation, through the massive exports. I was just looking at some of the figures, incredible production value, 33 billion, Farmgate 31.3 billion in exports. It's just enormous and huge and very important to our the economy of the nation, but also in terms of our export. It's something that we have to keep an eye on continuously to make sure that it grows and that that it is a very viable industry. Just looking at your submission summary, one of the things that I'd like you to perhaps tell us a little bit more about, and you speak a bit about it in the submission, is that there's a need for long-term investment in the supply chain. And I was wondering, where is it working pretty well at the moment, and where is it failing, and what the governments need to do to get that, to assist in that area?
It's quite a complex question, actually. But the reason we, I guess, promoted the supply chain aspect in our submission is that Australia obviously exports up to 75% of the production on an annual basis, and that requires quite a mammoth logistical exercise within each of the producing states to move that grain from the multitude of receival centres through to container packing facilities and through to grain terminals on the coast. And the efficiency of the Australian supply chain is one of the critical elements of the capability that Australia has to actually compete on the world stage. So it is important that our supply chain is efficient because that allows us to basically continue to price well into the markets, especially the markets in Southeast Asia and Asia, where we do have at the moment, we do have a sea freight advantage, but on occasions, depending on values of sea freight and other world trade pricing, sometimes that value can be quite low. So we need to continue to focus on economic efficiencies within the supply chain, certainly including the supply chain. If you look at Australia, there's a multitude of different actual arrangements and how the supply chain works. If you look to Western Australia, you've got a state where we have a cooperative that effectively, I don't want to use the word monopoly, but they're a controller. They control the supply chain from an efficiency perspective, and it allows effective investment and effective planning and a rational approach to moving grain from country receival points through to the port. Whereas in other states, it's more of a market-generated supply chain, and as a result, you've got multiple exporters all using the same assets within the supply chain. They're using the roads, the railway lines, the railway trucks, and the trucks, and they all have their own arrangements. So it's a little bit more fragmented, but it's a market, and the market tends to work well, and it generates investment. As you can see by, I think we might have mentioned in our submission, there has been a lot of investment in the supply chain since 2014 as a result, potentially of the market freeing up. So they are certainly different approaches to the supply chain. One is a fragmented multi-operator supply chain that includes a lot of growers involved delivering actually from their farm storage through to the ports and through to the container packers. And that's been a very important uplift in the capacity that you get in the fragmented markets, because it provides an extra fleet of road trucks to actually move grain down to ports and to export terminals. So they're both different. Both of them need the investment in better roads, more efficient rail infrastructure. We obviously need to continue to make sure that our freight networks work and work well both for grain and for other products that move from the country areas. So it does need planning from both the state government and the federal government to make sure that we're not losing efficiency over the years, but we're actually increasing efficiency. And that's really looking at the key choke points in each of the supply chains. And if you look at grain has multiple supply chains because they all have a destination point and an origin point. The origin points in Australia, certainly on the east coast, could be 20,000 origination points because we're now using farm storage as part of our supply chain. The exports endpoints on the east coast there's probably 120 container packers. Then you've got the bulk export terminals plus the mobile bulk loaders now up and down the coast. So it's quite a diverse and complex supply chain. But if we focus within each of the states and each of the paths to the coast or to the container packers, just look at the choke points and look at what investment, both from a government and from a private company perspective, we can make, we can improve the supply chain.
And in terms of, we spoke a bit about roads, rail, etc. Shipping, is there a competitive market out there to actually get the goods shipped? How does it?
Shipping also is
without the shipping, we can't.
Yeah, exactly. From a bulk market perspective, the global fleet and the global market for bulk shipment. It's quite a mature and quite a open market. Pricing's quite transparent, and it tends to serve the Australian grain industry quite well. The container market is a little bit more complex. Australia is out of the way, basically, from a country perspective, and the shipping lines do service Australia, obviously, because we demand imported products, and as a result, there's containers that we can then export. But there's difficulties within that market. There's also issues, obviously, that have been well reported in the press about stevedores and pricing issues that do prevent some challenges for the container market. The other issues in containers from a grain perspective is grain is a phytosanitary product, and it must go into a clean and watertight vessel before it can be shipped to an importing country. We, as an industry, tend to use 20-foot containers, and the 20-foot container fleet in the world is starting to disappear because the manufacturers are focusing on making 40-foot containers rather than 20-foot containers because they effectively make a greater margin out of producing those. So as a result, we're seeing the fleet of 20-foot containers that are suitable for grain, which are what we call food-grade containers. We're starting to see those reduce in number, and they require a container these days requires a lot more work to make it worthy to put grain in and to ship it. We're starting to see some challenges there. Not sure what the answer to that is, but we're certainly starting to see some challenges just from a capability within the supply chain with containers. And containers are an important market. They allow, certainly into places, especially like India, higher value, and also from a logistics perspective, a lot of the import countries just can't, or they struggle to manage bulk vessels because you've got a price, up to 50,000 tonnes in one transaction. Whereas with containers, you can buy anywhere from 100 tonnes to 500 tonnes boxed in containers. It's much easier to get the finance for that, and when it arrives in a country like India, you can either take the grain out and bag it on the wharf, or you can take the container inland and do that elsewhere. So it just presents opportunities in countries like India to actually purchase grain and take out,
Have you thought about contracting your own containers, your own 20-foot containers?
It's the shipping market's quite complex, and that's it would be very challenging because you just lose control of the containers. It's a little bit like pallets. The pallets that go in containers, the owners of the pallets really struggle to control where they are, and to take them somewhere and get them back is just about impossible within a relevant time frame.
Plus the contamination issues of food grade to, the backhaul might be batteries.
Correct.
And
Yeah.
it's just
Yeah, so we are looking at that and looking at ways to get around it. There's liners that you can use in a container, but they do have, and obviously have an expense to put the liner in and to purchase that liner in the first place. So there's a few things that we can do, but there's not a great margin in containers in the container trade in most years. It's fairly tight, so the imposition of additional costs through liners are not the preferred way to go, but in the future that may be the case. We can also use 40-foot containers, but they're certainly not as efficient from a freight perspective, because you've got a 40-foot container that you're only putting a very small portion of the volume. You're only using a very small portion of the volume.
because you're limited by weight.
By weight on the roads, yeah. Yep.
Can I?
Yeah, certainly.
Just while we're on this run, who are our biggest markets? I want to come to what Ukraine.
China and Indonesia, or Southeast Asia, would be our biggest markets, certainly this year. That can change. Obviously, China turns the tap on and off, and they're starting to send signals out at the moment that they've got enough supply for a while, and the demand's not there as it normally is. Their economy is struggling, so there doesn't seem to be as much demand for pork and meat products. So as a result, feed grains are off the boil at the moment. But Indonesia is quite a consistent market, quite a good market, and obviously we have a good sea freight advantage with them. But we need to do more work in that market, because we tend to capture a lot of the human consumption, but capturing the feed market there's been a bit of a struggle.
Yep.
Due to some non-tariff barriers and other associated political issues.
I want to come to the biosecurity barriers that you mentioned in your opening statement. But before we do, how much impact does the Ukraine conflict have on the grain market globally by not having that supply in the market, and then, God willing, that there's a resolution there? What's the outlook for the Australian market if that Ukraine supply comes back in globally?
Yeah, it's a good question, and market analysts would be better answered than myself. But just from personal opinion, when the Ukraine war started, obviously it took a lot of supply out of the market. And the market runs on supply and demand, and obviously the supply was lessened and the demand hadn't changed, so price did increase. And that was very beneficial to Australia, because it also aligned with a record crop. So that was of good benefit. When they come back on stream, obviously it'll be increased supply, but the market deals with that. If there is a drought somewhere in the world, the market takes that into account, and supply, yeah. Historically, over the last 15, 20 years, the world's fairly comfortable with the supply on the supply side until there's a drought or a war, and then there's spikes. But it will be interesting if there's any further conflicts. I'm thinking.
Biosecurity limitations. Where's your biggest roadblock? Where's your biggest hurdles?
That's a hard one to answer. It's usually around. It's always around the import country requirements. A lot of that's associated with weed seeds and issues with chemical residues. And we export to probably 190, 200 countries, and they all have different specifications, requirements from a weed seed and a chemical residue perspective. So understanding that in the first instance is quite difficult. Having the discourse and discussions with the import countries to set up tolerances and protocols takes a long time. So it's really starting the discussion and working over a number of years is the way we overcome those. So it's quite difficult at the moment. We've got a number of issues with China on weed seeds. A lot of that's in barley and in sorghum. For some reason, there's no issues with wheat. So some people say that might be just a political manoeuvre to slow down supply because the demand's not quite there in China. But Yeah, India's another country at the moment. We're doing a lot of imports of chickpeas to India, and India has a number of weed seeds issues as well. That probably they have the weed seeds themselves, but they put on zero tolerance or nil tolerance for specific weed seeds that are very prevalent in most producing countries.
So what would you have to do? Run it through a gravity table or something to
Well,
extract the seeds out and then charge them more?
Well, you tend to look at the risk and you look at the production, and traders will go, well, okay, in this area, in for example, northern New South Wales, southern Queensland, the prevalence of say Johnson grass is quite low, and we've got farmers that we know who control that particular weed very well. We'll concentrate on trying to buy grain in those areas and from those particular farmers to lower the risk. Apart from that, yes, you can use gravity tables, or you can take the risk, obviously, and go, okay, I've got some minimal amount of weed seeds because you can't get them out completely. I'll see how we go. Obviously, that's risky. It's a risk that the trade takes on when there's a nil tolerance, but having nil is practically impossible.
And last one from me, because this is an inquiry around free trade and the government's always interested in working with industry, does the industry have its eyes set on the next market? Where would you like, if you could direct the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to a particular country? Where's the next?
We certainly have those discussions, and at the moment there's a bit of a push into places like Brazil and Mexico. They won't be our prime markets, but there certainly be further markets that we can explore. It's interesting markets. You can have access to lots of markets, but you still might only trade with 3 or 4 major markets because of price. So the market will be always driven on price.
Where would Mexico and Brazil be getting their current product from?
Brazil would be getting from Argentina.
Oh, yeah.
But Argentina doesn't produce all the grains that they want. There's probably a demand for barley that we might be able to fill in. Similarly, into Mexico, there's a demand for barley that they could either get from the US or from Europe. But there's some opportunities that companies like AEGIC have been exploring and having discussions with the maltsters and the trade in those countries. So there are opportunities. Obviously, India's the one that we'd all like to crack.
It's huge.
Because yes, look, it's huge. There's lots of opportunities there. We've developed a strategic partnership approach that we'd like to take through to India, which we're working through with the department, and we're starting to look to do conferences and the likes and bring out delegations from India just to grow the market. But it's very much a protectionist market in India because of the political clout of Indian farmers. You always bear the brunt if they have a good harvest in India. Trade will effectively stop until they consume that grain.
Completely stop, or?
Basically completely stop, yeah, because the government will put tariffs on. Because at the moment the government have completely lifted tariffs on chickpeas, but that is only up to the 29th of March.
Okay.
And the chickpeas must be landed in country by the 29th of March.
And this is all under the FTA with India?
Yes, yeah. And the reason for that is there's a demand there and the local supply hasn't come through. It's been exhausted, so they need chickpeas. They're looking to Australia to fill the gap until their harvest comes through. Now, if their harvest is delayed or it's not as productive as possible, the lifting of the tariff may continue. But as soon as there's local production, that tariff will come back on. Yeah, about 60%, I think the tariff is. So, yeah, it effectively stops the trade.
Senator Polly?
Yes, so what about the Middle East and through the UAE?
Yep.
Because we've got a new trade agreement with them. What's the potential there?
They're certainly large consumers, and Australia has always focused on that as a market. It comes down to price, and I'd suggest that the market is open to Australia, but it basically comes down to, well, if you've got grain and you're looking to sell it, you've obviously got, you first look to your highest price options, and that might be Indonesia, it might be China, it could be somewhere else, and then you look to other bulk markets, and certainly the Middle East is a possibility. The Ukraine and Russia does put a lot of grain into that area though as well. So obviously there's a bit of a price battle to get Australian grain into there. So obviously exporters will look to maximise the margin that they can make in the first instance.
I would suggest, though, in the UAE, there's a very strong Australian business community there. So using those connections can be an advantage because they know the community.
Absolutely.
So that's an opportunity. But I was wondering, in terms of the free trade agreements that are in place now, have you got any that you can identify that needs to focus more on your sector? One
that we've always said that we'd certainly need to focus more on is Indonesia and feed grains. As I said, we can get human consumption grain into Indonesia, but we struggle to get feed grains into Indonesia, and it's quite a large market, and being able to sell into that market would be fantastic. At the moment, there is some production, obviously, in Indonesia that provides feed grain, and they buy corn from the US, we believe. So to be able to get into that market would be wonderful.
So what percentage does WA produce of the export?
I believe on average it's around about 43 to 48%. That's off the top of my head, so it's not a formal number.
But a lot of that is grown down the bottom around Esperance.
Esperance, Albany, and in what's called the Grain Belt, which is the Kwinana Port Zone, which is Fremantle. They're probably the major areas. And Geraldton, if it rains, can produce around about 2 million tonnes of exports. So
there's a fair bit of transport costs involved if you're coming from Esperance to Fremantle.
Well, Esperance has its own port, so grain in that zone will go.
So it goes straight out of Esperance, does it?
Correct.
Right. Okay. So that's why it's so competitive then.
Yes. Yep.
In relation to WA and around Esperance and Albany, the climate there is, mirrors Tasmania to a great extent. Have you got any theory as to why Tasmania's never got into the market to the extent that I think it could?
Tasmania used to have a grain industry and a grain elevator. They used to have a Tasmanian Grain Elevators Board.
Yeah, they did.
Many, many years ago. And they did produce grain. A lot of that would be consumed domestically. Why they're not a grain producing state probably comes down to other agronomic opportunities that they have because of their climate and the value proposition that they have, whether they grow grain or whether they grow animals or vines or even horticultural products.
In relation to Austrade, and you talked about needing some additional markets. More work needs to be done in Indonesia, certainly in India, to all your existing marketplaces. Is there more that Austrade can do to assist in terms of exposing the industry into new markets?
There's always more you can do, Senator. I guess it comes down to the budgets available and the costs and the value that governments get back from putting money into marketing trade of Australian products and managing trade issues.
Well, part of what we've had in other evidence and also from exporters from my home state of Tasmania is that to participate in trade fairs is expensive for smaller industries, but I would also say to your sector, to be able to be there centre stage. Is there more that could be done or things done differently?
So Which, look, I can certainly understand from a small industry perspective, it would be extremely difficult, whereas the grain industry obviously has some scale. Grain Trade Australia, in its own right, it's a national company. We are involved with international conferences where we go and promote Australian grain and the Australian system into our major exporting countries. We also support a number of delegations that come into the country. We also have groups such as Australian Export Grain Innovative Community Council, or whatever they call themselves in WA, and we have Grains Australia, and we have grower associations that all put their weight behind the grain trade and work on export and trade marketing effectively. So we're quite lucky in that regard. We also have some large companies such as Cooperative Bulk Handling in Western Australia, who are a grower cooperative, so they put a lot of effort and expense into marketing West Australian grain and the West Australian supply chain as well. So I'd suggest from a grain industry perspective, we're lucky. We work extremely well, I'd suggest, with the likes of Austrade and with the Department of Agriculture. We've got a long-term relationship. We have an industry consultative committee, which I'm actually at tomorrow in Canberra, and it helps sort out any, I guess you'd say, government and industry issues focused on export. So we meet, that's a quarterly meeting, plus we have a monthly operations meeting, and we also have everyone's phone numbers. So if we have an issue, we just get everyone together on a phone hookup. So I guess we're quite proactive as well, and that's important. And we've, over the years, developed quite good relationships with the ag councillors overseas and the posts and the ambassadors, so that also is quite helpful when there's an issue.
How successful do you think Australia's been in addressing the non-tariff barriers?
Relatively successful. They're quite.
What more can they do?
Obviously, that comes down to dialogue between countries. It comes down to being involved and being very proactive in international organisations such as the Codex Committee, and to push all countries to actually think about the chemical residues and to actually establish maximum residue limits rather than just having zero. So it's things like that, and that does require some government, certainly lots of government involvement, and obviously that then comes down to making sure that those government departments are funded adequately, that they can manage that task.
Well, when you consider your sector in particular, how important it is to regional and rural Australia's economy, the investment by government to assist this sector will get repaid over and over again, because it's the lifeblood of WA and a lot of other communities.
Well, it supports all the regional communities. That's probably one of the main things.
Absolutely. But thank you very much for the submission and coming before us.
Thank you,
Chair.
Senator Polly. In terms of the FTAs that are in place with different countries and regions, etc., is there any market where access for Australian exports has declined despite the FTAs being in place? And you spoke about some of the intricacies, for example, in India, where it can go up and down.
Yeah, India will certainly continue to go up and down, and really, if you look at the Indian free trade agreement, grain is sort of on the back shelf still.
Yeah.
We were going into India well before we had the free trade agreement.
Yes, and we'll continue to get in there when they want us, basically. Yeah. But a free trade agreement would. There's a number of issues with the Indian market that, from an environmental perspective, they're one of the import countries that has a requirement for mandated fumigation of grain.
Fumigation?
Fumigation of grain, yes, using methyl bromide at
Before
levels.
it leaves or when it gets there?
Before it leaves, just prior to it leaving, you need, even though the grain hasn't got any insects, and it may have already been treated in an up-country receival site, and it's free of insects. When it comes down to a port, or goes to a container packer, you must fumigate that grain with methyl bromide at probably 3 times the limit that we would use in Australia. So from an environmental perspective,
Are they doing it there, or we're doing it here?
we're doing it here.
Yeah, so
And
it's
we pay for it.
can of mortine, which will kill a human. They crack it, they throw it in the container, shut the door, and it becomes its own environment,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it kills anything inside there.
yeah.
And it's basically to try and control insects.
Yeah.
It is.
So it's-
The thing is, a lot of the grain that we send to India and other importing countries will be pulses, and if they're treated post-harvest, which most handling companies do that to kill the insects, because insects in a pulse are always inside the pulse.
Yep.
They're getting there during the growth period of the crop, and once they're out. They don't do any more damage to the grain. So we've always said it's something that India's always done. Some other countries, Pakistan does it as well, and it creates an enormous amount of usage of methyl bromide that, from our perspective, is not required. And the governments have been working on that issue for some time. Haven't got anywhere yet at this stage. We are doing some trials with phosphine, which is less damaging, with India. And they're on-board trials on bulk vessels. So they've been successful to date, but we would certainly like to do a lot more.
Just, you mentioned in your opening statement also about the logistics changed and how important the efficiency dividends are there.
Yep.
Just, there's only a couple of minutes left. Can you just expand out on what you meant by that, and maybe use some comparative data from like Canada and what their logistics efficiencies are and what we compete with, so it's on the record?
It's relatively complex, but it comes down to if you look at
Can we use cost to port?
cost of port. If you look at probably the best thing to do would probably be to point the inquiry to AEGIC, do a number of comparative supply chain cost reports on what it costs to move grain within Australia through to the port compared to moving that grain in the Ukraine, moving grain in Canada, and moving grain in other places. And
You have those numbers of those countries just mentioned off the top of your head for the benefit of Hansard. Can you just enter them, please?
the actual numbers themselves.
Just roughly, yeah.
Look, the Ukraine, from a freight perspective, inland freight perspective, is cheaper. I couldn't tell you the exact differential, but they are cheaper. But if you, a lot of that though is to do with labour.
How about you take it on notice?
I'll take it on notice and I'll send you
That way we
data.
get it,
Yep.
we get the right data.
Yep.
We're probably twice as dear as Canada.
It depends.
On bulk.
And on bulk, it depends. Their journeys are a lot longer, so it tends to, with rail particularly, longer journeys appear a lot cheaper on a cost of freight perspective. A lot of our internal journeys in Australia through to the port are less than 300 kilometres, where in Canada they're probably 1,200 kilometres. Yeah, so on a cost per tonne basis, their freight appears cheap. In the Ukraine, their freight appears cheap, but a lot of that's to do with the fact that they've got a very low labour cost in the Ukraine compared to Australia. And similarly I think they also looked at Argentina's supply chain as well. But I'll send you some data through on that.
Lovely. And any homework for the department? And you mentioned Mexico and Brazil.
I think keep working on India.
India.
Yeah, India's one to continue working on. It will be it'll certainly be a challenge and a long-term project.
Yeah, right.
Yep.
In terms of the regional communities where the majority of all the grain growers are in, and
Yep.
The people you represent, we know the benefits of free trade agreements to those regional areas, whether it be exported wheat or other agricultural products. Do you think the wider Australian community understands the benefits of trade and I suppose FTAs to your industry? But regional communities and other economies more broadly, do you think that the broader community understands it, and does that matter? Because it all has depending on how populations of the nation think and want and campaign on and lobby their MPs, etc. Do you think they understand the importance of free trade agreements on regional communities in the agriculture industry?
I wouldn't. I would think in the regions, in export orientated states, that understand the importance of trade, definitely, and obviously trade and three markets and transparent pricing, etc. In other states, in other industries, no, I don't think anyone understands the complexity, certainly, of trade and the costs associated with exporting any product, and the time and effort it actually takes for companies to actually do it. It's not easy.
One final question, just very broadly, if you can just give us the makeup of your organisation in terms of the board. Is it elected? Funding? Is there any? How does it survive?
How does Grown Trade Australia survive?
Yeah, in terms of where does it?
We're a very small. We're a very small association from a headcount perspective. There's 3.5 full-timers. The way the association works is we operate using technical committees, which are volunteers from our member organisations, and we manage those committees. And we have a committee that focuses on trade and market access. We have a committee that focuses on supply chain, one that focuses on the commercial aspects of the industry, contracts, trade rules, other arrangements concerning trade, and plant breeding innovative committee, and one that focuses on IT issues. So that's where most of our work is done, within those committees. Yeah, we're funded by our members, so our memberships are split into different groups. We've got, as I said, approximately 295 members, and we split them into different groupings based on their size. So our larger members will pay a higher membership fee based on the tonnes that they export than just a general member who might be a consultant that works in the industry, or a lawyer or a legal firm that provides services to the grain industry.
And in terms of, this has been my very last, I keep on saying the last question, always something else comes to mind. In terms of free trade agreements, and at the negotiating stage, when governments and government bodies and Austrade and everyone else is involved in the thick of it,
Yep.
Do you feel that you are adequately briefed and in the know, and giving your advice of what will affect your members and what will be negative or a positive in terms of some of the agreements? And how would you like to engage? Would you like to engage more in that process?
We certainly would like. We certainly like to engage more. We do have engagement. We tend to have a lot of engagement in the process leading up to and during the negotiation. We're certainly briefed and we're asked for comments on specific things, but then once the agreements are in the process of being informally agreed before they're signed, there tends to be negotiations or other discussions between countries on implementation processes, which sometimes we're involved with and sometimes we're not. The Indonesian one was a good example where we weren't involved, and there was some processes set up that if we had had involvement with, we would have said, well, look, let us actually manage that component of the implementation process, because we understand the value more than a government or a consultant, which they ended up hiring. So there is some intricacies or some complexity associated with the post-agreement process, depending on what was agreed in the agreement about implementation. And a lot of that can be, for example, with Indonesia, we'll provide some training, we'll provide some education processes as part of the agreement.
But you'd like to be able to be more involved if possible.
In those, yeah. Yep.
Good. Yep. It's good for us to know and to note it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, look, thank you very much. Unless Senator Polly's got any further
No, I was
questions?
just going to say if there's anything else that comes to you that you want to add, because you're already taking some things on notice.
Yep.
appreciate any further comments.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Today, we haven't quite finished. We've got some wording that we have to say, which we're required to say. Thank you for attending today. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, please send it to the Secretariat by Friday, 13th of December, and you'll be sent a transcript of your evidence, and we'll have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you.
Okay. Good morning. I now welcome the GrainGrowers Limited to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Annabelle McTeer, I'm the Policy Manager for Trade and Supply Chains at GrainGrowers.
Thank you.
Zachary Whale, General Manager of Policy and Advocacy at GrainGrowers.
Thank you and welcome. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I'll now invite you to make a short opening statement of a few minutes, and then we'll proceed to a discussion and a bit of a Q&A. So over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much for having us. A great time to talk about free trade agreements and their importance. We welcome the opportunity to speak to the Joint Standing Committee on Trade and Investment and Growth's inquiry into the understanding and utilisation of the benefits of free trade agreements. GrainGrowers is a national organisation working to enhance the profitability and sustainability of Australian grain growers, and we achieve this through our focus areas of policy and advocacy, grower engagement, thought leadership and active investment in future-focused activities for all growers. Australian growers are at the heart of all that we do and the focus of our work. As an island nation, international trade is vital for the Australian economy, equivalent to 45% of Australia's GDP and directly responsible for 1 in 5 Australian jobs. With the World Trade Organisation negotiations in a state of deadlock, Australia has pursued bilateral and regional trade agreements to further its interests, resulting in 18 FTAs with over 30 economies. As an export-orientated industry, effective trade agreements are especially critical for the Australian grain sector. Approximately 65 to 75% of our grain produced is exported each year, and in 2021-22, Australia exported a record grain, oilseeds and pulses, with wheat alone being Australia's 6th largest export. Our growers are some of the least subsidised in the world and therefore impacted by global trade distortions such as high tariff subsidies and non-tariff measures, which reduce the competitiveness and limit access for Australian grain, impacting grower profitability. The trade-exposed nature of our industry and the need to compete in global markets has driven productivity and efficiencies within our industry. And as we enter a period of increased political and economic uncertainty and upheaval, many governments are increasingly turning to trade barriers. Capturing the ongoing benefits of trade liberalisation will require Australia's trade negotiations to continue to focus on barriers such as tariffs and non-tariff rate quotas, along with broader technical market access issues and multinational engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else you'd like to add? I'll kick off with a couple of questions. I'll start off with the last question that I asked our previous witness, and I'll make that the first question for you guys. Do you want to just give us a broad background of the makeup of GrainGrowers Limited, what the structure is, funding, etc. Just very briefly, so we've got a very good idea of the structure of the...
I would love to. GrainGrowers is a membership body. We have over 15,000 grower members from across Australia. We don't have a membership fee. We're self-funded, and we undertake a range of advocacy activities on behalf of that membership, and also do some broader capability building, leadership programs and thought leadership work. Annabelle and myself, we work on agricultural policy, and how we do that is through what we call our national policy group. So we have 15 growers from across Australia that are elected to make up a policy council, and we work with them to make sure that we understand the grower issues of the day, and then we feed in what's happening at the Commonwealth legislative and regulatory space, and then try to make sure that those two things come together. So we have a very grassroots membership, and we have direct grower involvement in our policy setting processes. So even when we're working on submissions on different free trade agreements or anything before the Commonwealth Parliament, we actually have growers involved in that, which really helps make sure we stay on an even keel and stay alive to the most important issues to the grower.
Excellent. Can you explain how non-tariff barriers affect trade in the grain industry? And I suppose, what are the key non-tariff barriers that are experienced by the industry, and if they're, how can they be alleviated, or how can these be addressed, I suppose?
I'll get Annabelle to provide some specifics, and I'm sure the previous witness talked about it at length. In short, those barriers slow down trade. And so when you take a product from the paddock, it gets tested, its quality gets assessed, it then makes its way into the supply chain. There's then a whole range of export certifications that take place, goes onto a vessel, then the country, does the same checks and balances at their end, and countries can slow that process down significantly, regardless of what free trade agreements are in place. So in short, what it does is it increases the cost of an exporter getting a tonne of Australian wheat into a market. So on one hand, you can focus on how do you actually get tariffs reduced so that on paper we've got an equal playing field with that market. But then in practice, what happens is those processes that take place country to country just slow everything down and then create additional costs for the exporter. And what ultimately happens is those costs get taken off the price that ultimately flows through to the grower. So transport's the best example. If you take, the transport costs from port to a farm, once that's known, that's effectively taken off the price that the grower gets paid for the commodity. Export fees and charges and all of those other things that get built in, they similarly come off the grower's bottom line. But Annabelle might have some more specifics.
Yeah, certainly. So Grains Australia actually does an analysis every couple of years. I think they're currently reviewing the document, but they do an analysis of non-tariff measures. And in 2021, they found that there were 90 total non-tariff measures in 17 different markets. And I think these range from very reasonable requirements.
So it's 17 different requirements in 17...
No, 90 different... 90 in 17 different markets.
The type of thing that comes in under the 90.
Certainly. So it can range from basic biosecurity requirements, which is very reasonable, and Australia also has some non-tariff measures, but then it can extend to quite to barriers that are effectively trade restrictions. Restrictions on certain weed seeds that's impossible to actually to comply with, chemical restrictions. So it can be a full gamut of restrictions, and depending on the severity of the restriction will really impact whether we can supply into the market. And so some of it can add additional costs, but some can completely restrict us from selling.
Do they change midstream?
Pardon?
Do they change midstream? For example, let's say we've got an FTA, we've agreed on the requirements, etc. Do they? Yeah.
Yes, definitely, because they're outside of free trade agreements. Yeah. That's the complexity, is that we can technically have access into a market, but then countries can use non-tariff measures and quickly amend them, such as restrictions on chemicals that are always evolving, or prohibitions for certain pests, and so that can actually effectively, even though we technically have market access, we can actually be restricted from trading.
A backdoor method of increasing.
Exactly, and so that's where we see it needs to be. We actually have got quite good market access globally for the grain industry. There's some markets we'd still like to extend to, but in terms of agriculture, is quite good technical access. But we see this next tranche of work as really important, focusing on making sure that we have the resources to actually be able to utilise the access that we've got from the free trade agreements, and that's sometimes not thought of. I think sometimes everyone's very keen to sign a deal, and then there's a huge tranche of
afterwards.
Exactly. And,
Is there any? Do you have any examples? I don't expect you to have them, but
take on notice
today. But if there's any examples where those regulations, restrictions, changing continuously in order to use it as a backdoor, would you be able to?
I think what we could do is on notice we could actually provide I think that's a really great detail.
Good for us, for our benefit.
Yeah. And that provides in detail the full swath of non-tariff measures. I think I just want to make it clear it's perfectly within the country's right to have non-tariff. We have them as well to protect, biosecurity. But I do think there are certain countries that are using it as effectively as a trade barrier. So we can provide it to the committee.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I was really interested in your submission where you highlight Australia's, I suppose, we had a competitive advantage in Vietnam with exports, and all of a sudden, because Vietnam is signing up lots of free trade agreements with different countries, it's starting to diminish that competitive advantage that we had. Do you want to explain a bit more about that? It's pretty straightforward, I suppose.
This has allowed us to have an unparalleled opportunity for grain exports into Vietnam, which is a really crucial market. GrainGrowers actually did a trade delegation last year to Vietnam to see where our grain goes. If you have a banh mi in Vietnam or drink a beer in Vietnam, you're most likely having fantastic Australian grain, which is a lovely tie between our two nations. But I think the challenge is that now, as other countries sign on to have equal free trade access, I think the challenge is how do we stay competitive beyond just having less tariffs? And I think that's where we see a need for government resourcing for that next tranche of work. Is how do we continue to have the resourcing? One of the things that we particularly champion is agricultural counsellors. So we met with there's an agricultural counsellor based in Hanoi that we met with, and they do really important work in terms of, because so much of agriculture is so technical, as I'm sure you've heard throughout some of the proceedings. It's incredibly technical work, and so the agricultural counsellor in country complements the ambassador and provides that technical advice, and can often particularly work on non-tariff measures and be a really great conduit between the industries in Australia and the countries to kind of smooth over some of the non-tariff measures.
I think Mr.
So just to add on to that.
Yes.
Is there a quality difference? So is our PH grain the same as any other nationality's prime hard grain?
Look, I think there'd be other exporting nations that would have comparable quality, but Vietnam's a really good example. They like Australian grain
Specifically for their beer?
Because it's reliable. So they like our malt.
Their beer is a lot cheaper than our beer.
Just as refreshing, though. I can attest.
I'll take your word.
So I mean, I don't know if there's witnesses from Western Australia, but you know, a lot of Western Australian grain goes into Vietnam, both for malt and milling wheats, and those customers become very accustomed to the reliable quality of Australian grain, and it was the same with Australian malt barley into China. The industry had spent a lot of time customising what we grow in Australia to suit very specific customer requirements. So in a way, regardless of the trade barriers or the tariffs, often you get, and this is beneath the government level, you get really strong business-to-business relationships where the brewers, the maltsters, the millers, you know, feed back very specific quality requirements to organisations like the Australian Export Innovation Centre, the Grains Research and Development Corporation, all of our plant breeders, so that we can better nail the quality requirements they want. And then that's really frustrating because the grower ultimately then grows those improved varieties and tries to feed the customer requirements, but then for various political reasons, those markets turn off. And then what you do is you end up selling a less optimised quality product to a secondary market.
And governments over the years keeping an eye on this sort of, because it's one thing to go in and sign, as you said, the free trade agreement, but then all these other intricate happenings that take place. Are we keeping our eye on it, or is there a mechanism to monitor this and ensure that we're positioning ourselves to to maintain, I suppose, like in Vietnam, the competitive advantage that we've had for years?
I think there's some level of monitoring, but I think that could be better built into future trade agreements, and I think also better resourcing to complement and funding to complement the signing of a free trade agreement I think is really important. I think the emphasis, because it's a great press release to sign a free trade agreement, and I think maybe the actual practical things of implementing that is perhaps a less of a focus, and I think that could be a greater focus going forward, given that we've got such a large percentage of free trade agreements signed. I think this is the tranche of work that's really important to actually make sure that we're getting the most out of these free trade agreements.
An example would be we sign a free trade agreement and all these regulations come into place for a particular product and make it impossible for us to, or make it so hard, or add the costs.
And I think, so something that from an agricultural perspective that I think would be really important is increasing the amount of agricultural counsellors in particularly Southeast Asia. I know they're looking at, like, the Philippines could be a potential location as well. So I think it's those complementary things. The government published Invested, the economic strategy into Southeast Asia, I think is a great overarching strategy to complement free trade agreements. I think it is missing the nuance of agriculture. So I think additional funding for trade diversification, like previously there was the ATMAC funding, which I think was a great example of industry-led programs. I think that we really see the value in industry-led programs, because at the end of the day, trade is between business and two businesses. And I think when it's government-led, sometimes the outcomes can be short-lived because you don't have the business-to-business connections long-term.
Senator Polly?
Yes, I was going to ask in terms of freight, and we've had evidence this morning that there's a shift away from 20-foot containers to 40-foot containers. What's been your members' experience with that? Is that adding cost? Is there a difficulty in terms of using that 40-foot container as opposed to 20? What's the experience from your members?
I think at its simplest, you just have to have more unused space on a 40-foot container compared to a 20-foot container.
And I think, so growers themselves often aren't filling the containers, so that'll be done by the traders. But from what we hear from our trading colleagues, I think that's definitely a concern. Certain markets that won't be able to fit in smaller, particularly where the containers are going up tributaries in the destination countries, that can have an issue. And during COVID, that the access to food grade containers was a really big concern, and we're still seeing the long-term ramifications of that.
In terms of the free trade agreements that we currently have in place, is there more that your sector could achieve if there had have been more consultation through the entire process? Because the former witness said that it's one thing to have the consultation around the opportunities going into a new country, creating that free trade agreement, but there is then lost opportunity for the implementation on how that happens. Has that been the experience from your organisation as well?
As a general rule, I would say government, be it through Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade or Department of Agriculture, have been quite open to industry feedback in their preparatory phase prior to going into negotiations. They've certainly wanted industry to be vocal in terms of what specific quotas or barriers cause the most challenge or that we would like prioritised. I think then it's a question for government as to what's reasonable or possible in a negotiation, which obviously industry, like we would just say, well, we would want every, you'd want big quotas and low tariffs. But, government has to consider a multitude of factors when negotiating. But I would say we do have an opportunity to feed in. I would agree with the previous expert's comment that it definitely goes quiet once the negotiations commence, but that seems natural to me.
In terms of, there's been some trade restrictions over recent years do you see that changing now, and how do you see the market going forward in terms of from Australia's point of view?
It's a really good question. Annabelle will no doubt elaborate. I think we have seen a deterioration of the power of the World Trade Organisation over recent years. I think we're going to see that. Absolutely, we're going to see that accelerate with the current United States administration. I think what our industry is unsure of is what extent does that spill over and impact Australia. So the tariffs that the incoming president's going to impose, will no doubt cause disruption internationally, and we will have to monitor that very closely and work out, will it be an impact for the Australian grain sector? There could be some short-term benefits for Australian exports in the chaos, but if it leads to a deterioration of, in inverted commas, the rules-based order, that's been really beneficial for a country like Australia that's export dominant, then that will be a negative for us. So I think Australia has to really think about, in a new world where there's more disruption and less certainty, how do we, make sure that we get the access we need and that we have an arbiter or an umpire to review when things, I guess, I don't know how to best phrase it. If you take the Chinese tariffs on Australian barley, Australia argued that wasn't justified under the rules, and there was a process that we could go through that ultimately led to or contributed to a resolution, which got Australia back in there. Without that mechanism, would we still have punitive tariffs on Australian barley into China? Quite possibly. So I think it's in our interest to try to preserve as much of that international architecture as possible, because I don't think Australia is big enough to make the rules, but we're definitely a beneficiary of them.
So, for instance, the Ukraine war that's going on, although I think the President-elect said he could fix that in 30 seconds, but if that does continue on, are we going to see a benefit for Australia's grain growers? I mean, is the war actually impacting their areas where they produce the grain?
There's a fair bit to that. I think initially when the war first started, the biggest limitation was access. Were logistical issues getting boats into ports and getting the grain out, because there was already a crop well and truly underway. Those regions have continued to produce, and the logistics are somewhat operational now, and grain can get out. So there was definitely a short-term price spike, if you like, because 30% of the world's grain comes out of the Black Sea region. So prices definitely spiked. Then I think industry does what it always does and works out a way to make it work. I think we'll continue to see price spikes up and down if that conflict escalates or starts to impact ports and shipping again. You see increases to insurance or shipping lines just refusing to enter certain ports. But the world is dependent on that grain, and I think ingenuity will help get it out. And sometimes that crosses land borders, and then you see grain flowing into Poland, and there are ways and means to get the grain out.
So in terms of the evidence this morning was that there's certainly greater potential into India. We've got good resources going into Indonesia, but we could do more in terms of feed grain. What more can the Australian government do, either through the Department of Foreign Affairs or Austrade, to assist in those growth areas?
I think with Indonesia, and it probably comes back to Annabelle's previous point, there was a feed grain quota built in to that agreement, yet for political reasons we haven't seen any grain flow. So I think it's almost like there's a great opportunity in the negotiation phase, and there's a whole lot of effort to get something built in, but
Hasn't been implemented.
But it hasn't been implemented. So, look, I think there is a role for government definitely to continue to explore, if not, why not, and to help to help that come to fruition. There's probably also a business-to-business element that has to occur as well. But with Indonesia specifically, they are historically Australia's largest wheat market. They're second to China now. So, you know, there is a huge amount of grain that transacts between those two countries. But the feed component is obviously sensitive for Indonesia, and that would be...
Well, it's a very close neighbour, so the costs are good, so we can always be competitive, I would have thought, although I used to work for a shipping transport company, so I know some of the things that they do, but there is potential there, so perhaps you could take that on notice, and if there's anything more specifically that government can do through the agencies and the department, that would be greatly appreciated. Because the way I look at it, coming from a regional and growing up in rural Tasmania, the benefits of this sector to regional Australia, really, you can't really put a dollar value because it goes beyond the economy. It's about the lifeblood of the country. So do you think, though, there's enough recognition of the influence that your sector has on regional Australia by the government, and should they not be trying to do more?
I think definitely grains is often overlooked. I think historically people see agriculture as a nice industry and they don't recognise that it's an economic powerhouse and that we're one of the largest exports from Australia. I know when I've attended trade conferences, people are like, oh, do you export? And I have to explain that we do $30 billion worth of export, where we don't just export, we export at huge volumes and are incredibly important economically for regional areas. I do think that is not understood broadly. I think in regional areas, I think definitely there's a very strong understanding of the importance of and how farmers and the broader regional communities have benefited from free trade agreements. I think that is very widely understood. But the challenge is how we, I think there's definitely a need for a greater understanding of the importance for Australia. We're not a niche industry. We're incredibly important to Australia's economy. And I think also the other thing we've discussed a lot is the importance of strategically as well. We're the providers of a really important good that for our close neighbours. That is for food, for basic food. That is incredibly strategically important in terms of supporting food security in Southeast Asia. I think that is often overlooked as well. There's a strong link between a lack of access to grain and political instability. So I think that also needs the role that grain plays in supporting a peaceful region is really strategically important.
Two final questions. One is, do you think the government through Austrade and Foreign Affairs have the skills and are going to be nimble enough to actually manage the change in international world that we've known since Tuesday? It's a very different world going forward. Do you think we have the skills and going to be nimble enough to be able to pivot to other markets?
I think there's the skills. The problem is a long lead time to get access. Access to free trade agreements can take years of negotiations. It's not something we can just turn on and off. I think that it definitely needs to be significantly more investment in this space. I think it's not just the US election. It's also COVID and the Ukraine-Russia conflict have definitely contributed to substantial increases in trade protectionism, particularly for grain. We've seen that, so we've seen a complete reversal. Before that, we were moving towards a trend of trade liberalisation, but we've seen a substantial increase. I think it's really important that we're investing proactively rather than waiting for the next issue to happen. We need to be armed now. I think the great example that we always speak about is the ability for access into the Mexico market. I think people never thought that we'd ever export barley to Mexico, but because of the issues with China, we were able to nimbly pivot and through the CTP, I can never remember the acronym, apologies, the CTPTT.
Got it, we know which one.
Yeah, fantastic. We were able to nimbly pivot, and now that's our third largest market market for barley exports. That shows that with the right opportunity and ensuring that we're putting in long-term investment into market access, we are prepared if there is issues. But I think there needs to be substantial more long-term funding.
I think the other brief thing to add is that it highlights for us what we can do on the Australian side of the equation. So some of the international stuff you can prepare for and you can pivot and set yourself up, but we have to make sure our domestic supply chain is resilient, that we have access to critical inputs so that we can keep producing. Some of those things are controllable by Australia, regardless of what other countries do. So I think we've got to make sure our supply chains are robust, make sure we've got plans so that we can access all of the critical inputs we need. Most of our chemicals, the active ingredients are imported. There's a whole lot of fertiliser dependency on other markets. So if our international supply chains fall over, and they didn't completely fall over in COVID, but that highlighted how vulnerable we are, we need to shore those things up because other countries, don't dictate how resilient we are. We dictate that. So I think, if you can do those things really well now too, that hedges against some of that international risk.
And just to build on that point, I think also is looking at what are the opportunities we can grow markets domestically, and I think the Future Made in Australia presents a really exciting opportunity to be able to use Australian-based grain in low-carbon liquid fuels. I think that could be an amazing way to de-risk by diversifying our markets.
Chair, look, preempting my final question, and that is, we learned, if nothing else, we learnt through COVID that we actually have to produce more. We need to downstream process. I was going to ask you, in your sector, to me, there seems to be an awful lot of opportunities that we haven't tapped into. So can you elaborate a little bit further so I still get to ask my last question? Thank you.
We see a really exciting opportunity for grain, particularly canola and sorghum, to be used for biofuels or for sustainable aviation fuel. With the Future Made in Australia, where the funding, we see this as an amazing opportunity to increase domestic markets for grain that would go to export actually for biofuel in Europe. So it's not taking away anything from food production. We also see it as an amazing way to secure fuel security. 91% of our fuel currently is imported, so this is a great way to ensure that we have more resilient fuel supply, and then also increase regional manufacturing. So I think this is a really exciting policy that can deliver a multitude of benefits. The one thing I would say is that we see the need for a national feedstock strategy, which could complement the Future Made in Australia policy. I think that is the missing piece that would make sure that we've got all of the considerations and a roadmap to ensure that the Australian-grown feedstock can actually contribute into the sustainable aviation fuel.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks, Chair. Thanks for your submission too.
One final question from me, and I just want to touch on something that Senator Polly spoke about, and you did answer it, but in terms of the benefit of free trade agreements to especially regional areas, we know the regional areas understand the benefit that it gives to the economy, to the regional area, etc. Generally, though, from our previous witness and what you just said, is that doesn't actually resonate through the entire community. What can we do to make that message stronger so people have an understanding of the economic benefits of free trade agreements, especially in the agriculture area? How do we make that? How do we get that message out there? And is that for governments, for organisations like yourself? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't, but I agree that it's critically important.
Because it's important for the general public to understand the benefits.
I think it's critically important. Our growers absolutely know it, because every time there's a significant trade disruption, they see the bid really decrease, and then when they see markets come online, they see the bids increase. So they see it firsthand, and I think it is an important message to get across, because what we're seeing, I think, internationally is a return to or an increased level of protectionism, which is pulling away from the benefits you get from partnering with other countries and exporting. For Australia, that doesn't work. Our economy cannot survive without healthy exports. So I think that is a good message that we should all try to get across to the broader public.
And we were just discussing the US election and how both candidates actually had policies that promoted some sort of trade restrictions, and how that was actually based on the general public sentiment. There's been a strong shift away from seeing the benefits of free trade agreements. So I think strategically there's importance for all of us, the government and industry as well, to be promoting the benefits and communicating that, because otherwise we could see a rise in anti-trade sentiment because of a lack of understanding of the benefits, not just for big business, but for individual farmers. They can see that directly. I know the example that we talk about as well is chickpeas. Currently, the tariff has been temporarily removed in India on chickpeas, which has resulted in a substantial increase in the price. I think it's gone down slightly since we put into the submission, but that's an amazing opportunity. And I know we've got a bumper harvest of chickpeas currently being harvested in Queensland, and so it's examples like that we need to be communicating how that can directly benefit individual growers.
And I think final point on that, Australia thinks about food security in a funny way because we export so much. We don't really think that we have a food security problem, and we possibly don't, but we are a food security partner for so many nations. So I think every Australian would like the idea that we actually underpin the provision of protein to Indonesia, or we underpin the provision of protein to Saudi Arabia at different times. That's a good message, but I don't think people think that. I think they think we grow a lot, and therefore food security doesn't matter. It does matter.
Yeah. But it's also about security in the nation, security with our neighbours, having a stable, secure, global neighbourhood. Yep. Thank you very much. Any further questions by my colleagues? Being no further questions, thank you for submitting today. And thank you for the informative answers to our questions. If you've been asked to provide, I think there was a couple of things that we've asked you. If it's possible for that additional information, send it through to the Secretariat by the 13th of December, if that's possible. You'll also be sent a transcript of today's evidence, and you'll have an opportunity to request any changes that you feel if there's been any transcription errors. On that note, thank you.
Thank you.
Morning. I now welcome the Australian Dairy Industry Council and Dairy Australia to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee? We can start from one end.
Charles McAlone. I'm the General Manager of Sustainable Dairy at Dairy Australia.
Ben Bennett. I'm the Chair of Australian Dairy Industry Council.
John Williams, Deputy Chair of the Australian Dairy Industry Council.
Excellent. Thank you. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I'll now invite you to make a short opening statement of a few minutes, and then we'll proceed to a bit of a Q&A and a discussion. I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you. The Australian dairy industry welcomes the opportunity to speak at this inquiry. The dairy industry. Dairy is Australia's third biggest rural industry from the farm gate value of $6.1 billion. Australia is a major player in the global dairy exports, exporting to over 100 markets, and is ranked 5th in terms of the world dairy trade. Australia exports approximately 32% of its milk production, with exports valued at $3.6 billion 2023-2024. Exports are critical to the economic sustainability of the industry. Milk production in Australia exceeds the volume required for domestic consumption, with surplus product destined for the export markets. The Australian dairy industry has benefited from the activity leverage from Australia FTAs to access the global markets. The Australian dairy industry strongly advocates for the commercial meaningful FTA outcomes and actively leveraging Australia's FTA to access the global markets. FTAs like the Chinese Australian Free Trade, CHAFTA, and ASEAN, Australia and New Zealand free trade agreements have been pivotal in supporting Australian dairy export growth, particularly as dairy demand rises in Asia. Australian dairy has been able to capitalise on premiums offered by certain markets and has diversified its product mix since entering the FTAs with its major dairy markets. In many instances, Australia now enjoys a competitive advantage due to the outcomes of the FTA negotiations. Australian dairy exports to China rapidly increased in both volume and value following the signing of CHAFTA in 2015, illustrating that China is a major and lucrative market for Australian dairy products. Of note is the increased value of infant formula, particularly since 2015, which coincides with the signing of CHAFTA. However, FTAs are not a standalone solution and do not automatically provide Australian exports with an advantage.
So in recent weeks, the Australian dairy industry has welcomed the positive outcomes of the Australian-UAE Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which was obviously concluded in September. However, since then, New Zealand has quickly secured its own FTA with the UAE, but also additionally an FTA with the Gulf Cooperation Council. So this illustrates how rapidly competitive advantage can be diminished in the global market. While FTAs offer opportunities, barriers such as administrative burdens, non-tariff barriers and complex rules of origin limit their effectiveness. Increased pressure to include sustainability-related chapters within FTAs has the potential to compound the complexities of trading dairy. Department of Agricultural, Fisheries and Forestry's Overseas Agricultural Counsellors play a critical role in addressing non-tariff barriers in key markets, and continued funding is absolutely essential to provide Australian exporters with timely insights and a reliable channel for tackling these challenges effectively. In addition, over time, as other countries negotiate their own free trade agreements with our key trading partners, the competitive landscape can shift and erode previous advantages. JPA and CAFTA demonstrate how competitors can negotiate similar or even better terms, which then levels the playing field or even puts Australia at a disadvantage. Strategic negotiation and regular reviews of FTAs are absolutely necessary to ensure Australia maintains its competitive advantage in key markets. The Australian dairy industry has a strong history of collaboration with the government, essential for representing its unique needs in trade negotiations, and the constructive relationship between the dairy industry and the government agencies has been essential to ensuring that the unique needs of the sector are effectively representative in trade agreements. Moving forward, the Australian dairy industry remains committed to working closely with the government to leverage trade opportunities and maximise the benefits of free trade agreements, ensuring sustainability of the sector and the viability of Australian regional economies. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything further? No. Well, thank you very much for appearing before the committee today. We appreciate your presence. With us, we have the Deputy Chair, Mr. Bushholtz, and Senator Polly with us, and I believe we have Tanya Lawrence from Perth on the line as well. Are you there, Tanya?
Yes.
Excellent.
Thank you, I am.
Terrific, thank you. We might just kick off with a few questions. Very interested to hear more about the UAE that you spoke about. Senator Polly and myself were there last year, and they spoke to us about the dairy industry, and we actually met with some of your members who were actually over there at the time, and there seemed great potential from everything we heard. But as you said, things can change very rapidly and very quickly. We've just signed the UAE free trade agreement, and one of the first thoughts that came to my head was the dairy industry because of the discussions we had there last year. I'd like you to elaborate a bit more on that, of where we are with the free trade agreement, but specifically to your industry and the signing of the Gulf Corp. And I suppose also a bit about our competitors in this area, and who are our competitors. You've mentioned New Zealand, but I'm sure there's others as well.
Well, I might start off by just talking broadly about what the Middle East means for us as a market, and then maybe Charlie can talk a little bit more around what the specifics of this agreement may mean, and particularly with the move in New Zealand. But the Middle East has been a market that Australian dairy manufacturers have been investing in for a long, long time now. Yeah. It has its ebbs and flows through general global trade movements that can happen from time to time, but we have been a significant player in that market for quite some time and have a very good relationship with various customers over there and brands that are well established in that market. It's not lost on us that it's very close to the European market, which is obviously a major competitor for us, and so you'll see from time to time excess flows of European product come into that market, which makes us a little bit less competitive. But our focus there is really on that long-term trade, and so we're very, very keen in relation to the UAE, as well as the ongoing benefits we may have out of GCC. And once again, as a long-term market for Australian dairy manufacturers.
The only thing I'd add there is, as a result of that agreement from entry into force, we'll see a removal of the 5% tariffs, which are pretty much blanket across all dairy exports to the UAE.
So removal of 5%.
A removal of the 5% tariff on entry into force. So not a phase-out period. It'll go from entry into force.
Okay.
Which is really positive, that we will see a quick removal of those costs. It doesn't take away from the fact that we still have, it's a still highly competitive market, as John said, with the New Zealanders and Europeans in particular, but also the United States. There's also some long-standing historical connections, particularly with the EU and the Middle East, where which will still be challenging to compete within. And on top of that, as we flagged in the opening address, since we have finalised our free trade agreement with the UAE, New Zealand has also finalised their own free trade agreement, and then on top of that has also negotiated and completed an agreement with the Gulf Cooperative Council countries in total, which picks up on major markets like Saudi Arabia and the like as well. So again, just reinforcing that it's a moving feast out there. It doesn't stand still, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the UAE agreement is a huge windfall for the Australian dairy industry in terms of our presence and competitive positioning there.
And apart from the UAE and Middle East, where are our other major markets or new emerging markets? Well, you spoke a bit about China.
Yeah, sure. China is our largest market. Between 35 and 40% of our total exports go to the Chinese market. It's been an enormous growth that we've seen in that market, and that's really escalated since that chapter agreement that Mr. Bennett highlighted in the opening address. But our major presence is across this Asian region. Japan is the next largest market, but then closely followed by many of the Southeast Asian markets, Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam. But in that mix as well is Saudi Arabia and the UAE as the two major markets in the Middle East. But the bulk majority of our export volumes are going into this Asian region: China, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia.
Yeah. Any presence in Vietnam?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and a really amazing, strong growth market for global dairy and for the Australian market presence. So, that's a really great prospect for us.
Thank you, Deputy Chair.
Yeah, guys, I was just interested earlier on in your opening comments around. We think we have good deals sometimes with our free trade agreements, and I liken it to kids' lunch boxes. When you're hungry and you open up and you got your Vegemite sandwich there and a piece of fruit for lunch, and you think, how good is this? And then the Kiwi kid opens there and they've got a Christmas banquet when it comes to the equivalent of their free trade arrangements. Why do they do it better than us? And what do we need to do to match them, particularly on some of the step-down tariff arrangements that we've got to catch them, which will take, in some trade arrangements, nearly a decade for us to get to equivalency?
I think firstly, if we're talking specifically about New Zealand, obviously the dairy industry is such a massive industry for them.
Yeah.
So probably the level of resources they pump into that from a ratio perspective is probably bigger than ours. I mean, it's their biggest agricultural export and their biggest export.
And much bigger than ours.
And much bigger than ours.
Yeah.
And so with that, of course, the energy and the focus that goes into, the dairy industry alone over there is probably bigger than, much bigger than what we have here in Australia. Not to say that we haven't taken the lead and have maximised benefits before New Zealand in a lot of cases. But once again, as you rightly said, they're very, very quick to catch up. And I think that's probably the concern that we have, is making sure that we can at least keep a pace with those movements. Not just New Zealand either. This is they're not the only kid in the schoolyard looking at our lunchbox. If we're able to get a good deal, and everybody wants that part of it. So
I'm just trying to think globally. Who's the kiwi producer? Is it Fonterra?
Fonterra's the largest, yes.
And then we don't have a Fonterra here. We have Parmalat and
we have Fonterra has a presence here.
We do.
Yes.
So
Subsidiary of New Zealand.
Oh, are they? Yeah, I was going to say. So would they give themselves a competitive advantage by pricing themselves out of the market here to give the
No, I don't think that happens. I mean, they have invested in this market and been very focused on driving commercial returns in this business. Otherwise, they wouldn't have invested in this part of the world. They don't play that sort of game. We've never seen that play out.
Okay.
I think the only thing to add here is that we shouldn't underplay that the Australian dairy industry, the Australian market is a significant market for the global dairy industry as an importer. We're the fifth largest exporter of dairy in the world, but we'd probably be about the 12th largest importer of dairy.
Would that include dairy products?
Yeah, can you explain that? Fresh milk,
a lot of cheese, a lot of the pizza toppings that you'd see. A lot of the cheese would be imported. A lot of the ingredients, a lot of private label cheese in supermarkets. Butter, a lot of butter. We are a prime target for many of those international competitors. So from that perspective, even the EU really highlighted that, the negotiations with the European Union. The dairy industry in Europe was determined to get access to the Australian dairy industry, to remove one of the last remaining tariffs on in Australian agriculture on imported cheese, while at the same time classifying Australian dairy as a sensitive product for accessing the European market when we put less than 500 tonnes into that market in a given year.
It's minuscule, really.
Crazy. We're importing from Europe about 70,000 tonnes of dairy. So, I think to your point earlier about, we should recognise that, that the Australian market is a lucrative market for these countries as well. We are very much a trade-dependent industry, the Australian dairy industry, but and rely heavily on market access. But we do find it crazy at times when some of these markets which we are negotiating with, downplay the advantage of getting access to our market as well.
What's our tariff on that?
It's $11,200 a tonne for everything above 11,000 tonnes. I think that's roughly the amount.
Sorry, can you just repeat those figures? I didn't.
$11,000.
1,200 tonnes. $1,200 a tonne for everything over 11,000 tonnes of total.
1,000.
$1,200 a tonne.
Yep.
Is just for cheese. For everything over 11,000 tonnes. So that's a multilateral quota amount. But it should be said that with every FTA that we have undertaken, except for the UK, that's had unfettered access without paying that tariff from day one of the agreement coming entry into force. So the United States has total duty-free access. The New Zealand has total free access. Europe wants it, and that would be a lucrative for the 25 to 30,000 tonnes of cheese that we import from Europe.
Is it cheeses that we don't actually produce here? For example,
we produce all these cheeses.
We produce all those cheeses.
Yeah, absolutely. And on top of that, this is one of the other elements that we see in dairy. It's not just about quotas and tariffs. With the EU was really one of the key highlights that it also incorporates things like geographical indications
the GI stuff.
About our ability to, we are fine producers of many cheeses with European origin, which, obviously the Europeans wanting to curb our use of the words feta and parmesan and halloumi and others.
Strong argument for feta that's been made here in Australia by Greeks for over 100 years.
Well, there's no denying. I mean, we've got this strong Greek, Greek heritage, and a lot of these cheeses, they've become recipes, common recipes over many times, and they've been embedded as common names within the global trading environment. So these types of things emerge. We're watching this now with sustainability measures coming into the broader conversation around free trade agreements. John mentioned about non-tariff trade barriers, and while we can find that you can get market access, then that underpinning that can be the emergence of some of these non-tariff barriers that at times can be either something like a GI or underpinned by a sustainability, expectations or what have you, which ultimately are really about stopping trade.
So the Australian Dairy Industry Council, as witnesses here today, you're telling us that you want us to get rid of the tariff on the cheese, and no, you want to keep them?
We're just saying that no, absolutely. I mean that is something that it is very much, it's part of our WTO agreement, and obviously we recognise that that's attractive for those wanting access to the Australian dairy industry, but absolutely we would not give that up unilaterally.
Thanks, Bob.
Tricky you tie that in with the geographical indicators. I mean, it was 12 months ago we walked away from that agreement, and that was the best outcome that we could possibly expect. Now, that agreement's not off the table. We know it's going to come back at some point in time, but we just reiterate that sometimes the best deals you can do are the ones you don't do. Yeah. So.
I might just ask Ms. Lawrence, who's on the phone, if she has any questions.
Thank you. It's been very interesting to hear you describe the opportunities that have particularly come for the industry. And I just wonder whether it's reflected the same in Western Australia, whether you've got much data there, because my understanding is it's always been a bit of a struggle for the dairy industry to be sustainable in Western Australia. We have obviously a very short season of green to get nice fatty milk from which to make cheese and other products anyway, but the transport costs and the like. And I just wondered if you've got some insights there as to how Western Australian market can benefit more from the export, unless you think it already is fully optimised.
On one part, you're exactly right. WA is very much a small dairy production part of the world. But within that, and with probably some of the pressures that has brought it, it's really come out on top now in regards to its offering. It's created very much of a high value niche offering in actual fact. It was two WA manufacturers that recently won the Australian Grand Dairy Awards, overall awards, the last 2 weeks ago. That's something that's unprecedented. So already there's this strong level of manufacturing coming out of there in relation to high-end value products. It's also its proximity to those Asian markets we were talking about, particularly with direct routes into Southeast Asia now. Many companies are benefiting from that. One of the major companies that have really increased their exports over years is Browns Dairy, and they've been very successful in not only in the Asian market, but recently they've launched their products into the UK market. So there's a lot of exciting things that are happening in that part of the world.
Just to reinforce that, absolutely. Some really positive. It's a really positive industry. While it's a smaller level or scale, its export profile, and particularly, as John said, access into the Southeast Asian markets and proximity to those markets, its exports are dominated by UHT milk and some cheese. But it doesn't have the same kind of manufacturing capacity that we see down in the southeastern corner of the country. But in saying that, it is still highly regarded and quite prominent across many of those Southeast Asian markets, particularly some of the Harvey Fresh brand of UHT and the Browns cheese.
And do you feel, though, that to try, like, is it the manufacturing side that the capacity needs to develop rather than any modifications to the trade agreements themselves and ensuring that there's particular benefits that flow to incentivise the growth in manufacturing capacity? Like, where is it? Where is the pinch point really to develop it further?
Look, it comes from both. I mean, free trade agreements have created commercial opportunities that probably didn't exist, and so manufacturers are very quick then to pivot their capacity, to pivot their capabilities to meet whatever those markets are thrown at them, and what particularly consumers are looking at. So it comes both ways, but I think once again it all starts at the marketplace, and if you don't have that access, then you can't really develop your business to be able to get to those consumers.
And with the rise of coffee consumption, particularly in countries like China, have you noticed the corresponding uptick in milk from Australia, or are they accessing it from other markets?
I think more broadly with Asia, what we are excited with that region is just the overall increase in per capita consumption of dairy products. They absolutely have latched onto the nutritional benefits of dairy, and we're seeing that play out quite a bit all the way through to government policy, and with the recent announcement from the new Indonesian government around a platform to be able to provide school children with subsidised milk products is a fantastic initiative. But once again, it's acknowledging the benefits of dairy nutrition at that young age, but also in the general populace. So I think that's probably more what's driving demand and excitement within that region, rather than a specific increase in coffee consumption. I think it's all part and parcel of a bigger push.
Fantastic. And have you found the fresh market from, again, just thinking about WA, in particular, with its benefit and proximity to countries like Singapore and Indonesia, Philippines, have there been a corresponding shift in the logistics to enable fresh milk, or is it largely still centred around UHT?
Look, largely around UHT, but there's been a lot of work done over many, many years to try and work out what is the best way of getting fresh milk into those markets. Not only through the logistics that's required to do that, given the short shelf life on products, but it's also increasing the short shelf life of fresh products as well. And so there's a lot of work being done on that, and we'll continue to do so. And we have seen an increase of fresh imports into these regions because of that, and we're likely to see continuous increases as well.
Because I'm always a little surprised about how much East Coast milk is on our shelves as fresh milk. It always is a bit of a head spin to think about the logistics and the carbon footprint alone to bring East Coast milk across. But anyway, thank you very much. I think it's very encouraging, and I know it's a sector that we really want to see thrive, and they've been through some rough patches, and it's very encouraging to hear your words that their niche areas in particular are where West Australian dairy is really coming out on top.
Definitely, yes, it's exciting.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms Lawrence. I'll now go to Senator Polly.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for your submission. I think one of the reasons why East Coast milk is on the shelves in WA is because it has a bit of flavour, really, but vested interest. In terms of, I guess from where I come from in Tasmania, the greatest dairy export has been baby formula for us. Is that still significant?
Yeah, look, that is still significant, and once again, it's a value add push that I guess Tasmania and other parts of the East Coast have pushed into, pulling away from what really was the domain of New Zealand in regards to being a bulk ingredients producer. We've really pivoted ourselves to try and add value where we can, and create long-term markets for that. So that will continue in various forms, and once again, extracting out the value we see in dairy nutrition, and finding new ways and new formats and new consumers for that. So that will continue. Maybe not just in infant formula, but also for the whole of population as well. We're seeing much more consumption, increasing consumption amongst the elderly and so on, all around similar sort of formats and ingredients.
I think you're right in terms of the expansion in China. Hopefully will continue in Indonesia, Philippines, through Asia in terms of the nutritional value of dairy is really important for us. Likewise, though, now with state governments tending to go to providing lunches into schools, I think there's a big market there as well, because I think there's some concern about the lack of consumption of milk in Australia as well. So, but getting back to trade, in terms of the European trade agreement and their insistence on keeping their names, and we've talked about cheese already, that we produce many of the same cheeses, but we're also a big importer of Europeans, and they tend to, as they've got older, living here, still prefer the traditional cheeses that they would have brought. So do we need to do more about marketing here in Australia? And what more can we do in terms of pushing our dairy products into Europe?
I think on the first piece, I think our manufacturer have done a fantastic job in establishing these European cheeses over the past 3 or 4 decades that, as you said, didn't exist way back when. And now they are, a major platform within not only the supermarkets, our restaurants, hotels and everything now. And that was created largely, not from imported products, but largely what was done by domestic manufacturers, showing Australian consumers, this is what we can offer you, this is what we can do for you. That's where all the grunt work has come. And so I think that's where Australian dairy manufacturers get a bit concerned, is that Europeans are riding on the coattail of all that work that we've done now. I think from a quality perspective, we can be very, very proud of what we're doing and are very, very competitive with the European offering from a quality offering point of view. I think where it comes a challenge is if there is a cost difference in that competitive landscape. And we have seen from time to time, whether it be through subsidisation or other areas where European manufacturers have been able to land product into this market below sometimes what our cost of productions are, and that can be concerning.
So through my experience in Asia, the first time I went overseas, I was amazed to see New Zealand dairy products dominating places like Hong Kong, Thailand compared to Australia. We've now surged in those areas. What was the levers for our success there? Was it purely about marketing? Was it about trade fairs? How did we turn the tide?
It was all the above. It's that effort that the industry puts in partnership with the government as well around these things to push our credentials, and that's an easy sell because we produce very, very good products here, and the consumers are very much aware of not only the quality of that product, but the safetiness of that product, and that's been able to get us into markets relatively quickly because of food quality concerns and standards that may have shifted in certain areas. We've always been very, very strong on that basis. So having those credentials is what's enabled us then to go and market and sell our products.
So what more then? I mean, this inquiry is about ensuring that we get more out of our free trade agreements. It's also about raising awareness, but it's also bringing to the government's attention what more that Foreign Affairs Department and Austrade can do to support our exporters. So have you got anything further to add to your submission?
Yeah, I think the investment that's gone into that by the Australian government absolutely needs to continue. It's a combination of the market access through free trade agreement negotiations. It's then following that up with that partnership we've had with the government in the past in relation to promotion, trade fairs, whatever it needs to be. We need to continue that up because the New Zealanders, the US are pumping just as much or even more into those programs. And we need to continue that. Charlie and I off to Japan this week, where we're now celebrating 25 years of a special relationship which we have with Japan. And we really took the lead on that as a country in relation to that type of relationship. And of course, going back to the lunchbox analogy, our trading competitors are very, very envious of those relationships, and so they'll even up the ante in relation to the amount of money they pump into those programs. So we need to ensure that we continue that investment.
But like any relationship, you have to keep feeding it and nurturing it and looking after it.
Absolutely.
Can I just add on that? I mean, because it's a really important point. And the Dairy Australia programs, as I said, as John mentioned, has been going for 25 years now across China and Japan, and about another 10 years in Southeast Asia. We couldn't run that without the support of government. We rely on strong support from the federal government, through Austrade, as you mentioned, export market development grants, but we also have a strong partnership with the Victorian government. And obviously they recognise the strong strategic importance of dairy to the Victorian economy and Victorian regions. But they have been invaluable with uses, with use of their network across Southeast Asia, and then, as I said, in partnership also with Austrade, we really rely on that, and that's been hugely successful. And it's a real benchmark in terms of a program because that longevity and investing in the people and the networks behind these relationships, which really run the trade, those relationships. The other point I'd just make is that we touched on the issue of the agricultural councillors who are stationed within embassies across the globe, and I would not underestimate the importance that they play in, particularly with perishable food items, in overcoming the obstacles which emerge every day of the year. Somewhere there is a container load of Australian agricultural produce that's held up in a container on a port somewhere, and just overcoming some of those challenges. Those roles are invaluable, and making sure we continue to invest in them.
Just a couple more questions, if I can. In terms of the benefit to regional areas, as with the grain sector, I mean, dairy really, it's the backbone of those regional communities. So, it's good to hear that the Victorian government recognises that, because it's more than just the economy, it's about the lifeblood. Is production up or down in Australia in terms of what you're producing? Because we hear all the time that there's struggles, milk prices here at home, but, have we done enough in terms of making sure we've got dairy farmers going forward?
You want to ask that, Ben?
Yeah, well, we've gone down 30% in the last 20 years, so the answer is pretty straightforward, isn't it? Yeah, so a lot of cost of production issues. We're large push to try and flatten our milk curve, satisfy the domestic market, but that comes at a cost. And then on the other side, we've got imports. For example, Europe, 70,000 tonnes, and we're sitting there worrying about EU regulations placing more and more red and green tape around our necks, which is quite a dissatisfaction to get up at 4 in the morning to milk.
Yes, coming from a dairy sector, I have to say, no way. Personally, it's a hard job and undervalued for what this industry does for the country, locally, let alone internationally and with trade. But in terms of the future, we've heard about the non-tariffs and the impact that's having, and let's be frank, it's a backdoor method of restricting opportunities. What more can the government do through Austrade and Foreign Affairs to address those issues? There's some valid reasons, and we've heard that in terms of, but it shouldn't be used as a backdoor method of reducing opportunities.
And I'd say that the Australian government is really, they're awake to this. This has been something that we've partnered with Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry and Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade on for many, many years. And in terms of when we negotiate FTAs even, we're always mindful of what can emerge as, in this whole bracket of technical market access issues. And indeed, there's a multitude of issues around various markets at the moment that we're currently working with them on. So I don't know if there's necessarily a huge problem with what we've been doing. I just think it's always a factor to make sure that it still has prominence and there's awareness of how much of an issue it is, so we continue to invest in it. And we know that there's always budget pressures within government, particularly for those people who are in market, whose job it is to deal with those. So it's let's just make sure in the first instance that we secure the resources and the effort and the focus that we have on that at the current time, and that's the starting point. Could we benefit with more? Absolutely, but let's secure what we have.
I'll stand on to that. Probably one watch out is, and this isn't an historical accusation or anything, it's more about a watch out going forward, is just the bureaucracy needs to keep a pace with what's happening in those global dynamics. And I'll use the Indonesian situation as an example. So they're gung-ho wanting more products out of Australia. We have 5 factories at the moment have gone through all the documentation process and everything to get accredited to be able to export that market. But for various reasons, that's getting held up. Now, that's not an accusation of the government. We want to make sure that the government's ensuring that some of these things are expedited as quickly as we possibly can, so that we can get the benefits out of these fast-moving opportunities.
Just one final one, I might have missed it. The Indian market?
Yep.
How big is that to us?
Not big at all, largely due to serious market access obstacles that are preventing Australian dairy getting access.
Thanks, Chair.
With the FTA, that's just been...
We got some infant formula, and that was it, infant formula access. And now those companies, I understand, they're working through some of the technical issues about how they can make that work, but it's still not a straightforward process. But the bulk majority of Australian dairy production was locked out of that interim agreement, and that's why we're working very closely with government to make sure that the final agreement really picks up on those gaps.
Ms. Polly?
That's it, thank you.
That's it. Ms. Lawrence? All right. One last question from me. In your submission, you speak about you emphasise the FTA with Taiwan, and it's a significant gap in Asia, and that we're missing opportunities. Do you want to elaborate a bit more on that? When I see Taiwan, I see it as very similar relationship that we have with Japan. We're massive exporters of other products to them. We import massive amounts of electronics, etc., from Taiwan.
It's quite simple. New Zealand has a comprehensive free trade agreement, which largely means that their dairy industry has 0 tariffs going into that market, and they've had that arrangement for some time now, and we still haven't been able to secure a bilateral agreement with Taiwan. And we would like to correct that, because we're losing market share as a result in what is, as you say, quite a solid dairy market, which offers significant returns. And
the fact that I suppose that there's opportunities there that you guys would have seen.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. And similarly, the only other call out would be in Japan, where we were the first to actually do a comprehensive free trade agreement with Japan. But since that time, we've been superseded by other key markets in a market where we've had such strong historical ties with. Yet we now face a competitive disadvantage in some tariff lines, particularly around cheese, which we want to resolve.
Thanks. Any further questions, Ms. Lawrence?
I'm fine, thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for appearing before us today. If you've been asked to provide any further information, please send it to the Secretariat by Friday the 13th, or if anything else comes up that you feel that you forgot to mention today, please let us know. and send it through to the Secretariat. You'll be sent a transcript of your evidence, and you'll have an opportunity to request any corrections to the transcript if you wish. And finally, I'd just like to thank you for appearing before us, a very important industry to Australia and to our economy. Before I declare today's meeting closed, I'd like to thank my colleagues who are here, the Secretariat, and of course Hansard for keeping a good and accurate record, and all the witnesses. On that note, I declare the meeting closed, and we'll reconvene at the next meeting. Thank you.